Hello, thank you so much for the invitation to participate in this event, and I'm only sorry that I cannot be there at the moment. However, I'm grateful for the opportunity to express my views regarding the participation of Russian and Belarusian athletes in the Olympic Games. I have repeatedly commented publicly on the illegality of the war in Ukraine and the suffering and human rights violations that this war brings. I have made several public statements and continue to be very actively involved in commenting on the effects this illegal war has, both on the cultural heritage in Ukraine and on the cultural identities in Ukraine. On the 14th of September 2022, though, jointly with the Special Rapporteur on Racism, I sent a letter to the International Olympic Committee. In that letter, I expressed serious concern about the recommendation to ban Russian and Belarusian athletes and officials, such as judges, from international competitions, based solely on their nationality, as a matter of principle. This raised serious issues of non-discrimination. My interest is part of my wider concern about increasing unjustified restrictions affecting Russian and Belarusian artists, academics and scientists merely on the basis of their nationality, not only abroad but in their own countries since the Russian aggression against Ukraine. The right to participate in cultural life, which is protected under international law, includes the right to participate in sports, hence my interest in the exclusion of Russian and Belarusian athletes from sporting events. I chose to send the letter to the IOC as in September 2022 because the IOC has affirmed through its strategic framework on human rights its commitment to respect human rights within its remit in accordance with the UN guiding principles on businesses and human rights. Also, Fundamental Principle 4 of the Olympic Charter confirms that the practice of sport is a human right and establishes that every individual must have the possibility of practicing sport without discrimination of any kind. Fundamental Principle 6 repeats this prohibition of discrimination. So, there it goes. The continuing blanket prohibition of Russian and Belarusian athletes on the basis of their nationality violates the principles of universality and non-discrimination, two of the most fundamental human rights principles. Such a ban confuses states' behaviors with individuals' behavior, something that international human rights law prohibits. Punishing individuals, athletes, solely based on their nationality for the heinous acts of leaders over which they have no control undermines this distinction between states and individuals. Further, such blanket prohibition actually undermines peace rather than promotes it. The practice of sport is an instrument for preventing conflict and promoting long-lasting peace and development objectives, as the United Nations has recognized. In the face of threats to peace and security, we should all resist to being lured to further aggression. Instead, we should maintain our checks and balances when it comes to restrictions of human rights. Searching for avenues that allow all athletes who have not committed human rights violations, whatever their nationality, to engage in sports is acting to prevent the further erosion of our common values and to promote peace and understanding. Now, this does not mean that restrictions of athletes are not allowed under international human rights law. International law authorizes limitations and restrictions to most human rights, but following specific standards. Limitations to the right to participate in cultural life, including sports, must be determined by law, must pursue a legitimate aim, must be compatible with the nature of the right, and be absolutely necessary for the promotion of the general welfare in a democratic society. So any limitations must be proportionate, meaning that the least restrictive measure must be taken where several types of limitations may be imposed. When restrictions are coupled with the breach of the non-discrimination principle, meaning they are applied to some people only, there is a strong presumption of incompatibility with international law, and the test has to be more stringent. So how does this apply in our case? A blanket ban based solely on nationality is the most restrictive measure, not the least restrictive measure as required by international human rights law. It is disproportionate to the aim that we are trying to achieve. I do not exclude the possibility of a series of escalating measures on a case-to-case basis, and if necessary, depending on how the situation unfolds. However, less restrictive measures must be adopted first, notably exclusions based on individual conduct of athletes, whatever the nationality. The relocation or cancellation of events planned in the Russian Federation and Belarus, the recommendation not to display the Russian or Belarusian national flags and not to play the Russian or Belarusian anthems in international sports events, are sanctions that can be considered as legitimate as they directly target these states or their official representations. Also, the active support of Ukrainian athletes are welcomed measures because they are positive measures that are allowed and even encouraged in international law to ensure substantive equality. The discussion, therefore, only concerns athletes competing as neutral athletes and officials such as judges. So there is a concern that if Russian and Belarusian athletes are allowed, sporting events will become platforms for war propaganda. This is a legitimate concern. International human rights standards provide specific and clear guidance. Athletes engaging in propaganda for war can't be excluded. This, in cases, would be a legitimate restriction of cultural rights. Article 20 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights states that any propaganda for war shall be prohibited by law. Any advocacy of national, racial, or religious hatred that constitutes incitement to discrimination, hostility, or violation shall be prohibited by law. Also, athletes engaging in speech that does not amount to propaganda for war as such, but violates the rights of others or public order, can also be restricted. And this is following Article 19 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights that allows for restrictions to freedom of expression as long as the test that we mentioned above is followed. In addition, under Article 4 of the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, all incitement to or acts of racial discrimination must be eradicated. But again, as mentioned above, the least restrictive measure must be adopted. In addition, distinction should be kept between freedom of opinion and freedom of expression. While freedom of expression can be subject to restrictions, freedom of opinion is an absolute right. So any questions by sporting associations about the athletes' support of the war would cross that line. There are also security concerns and concerns about the safety as well as the physical and emotional well-being of Ukrainian athletes. I understand that. I understand the emotional distress caused by the aggression against Ukraine, as well as the idea that Ukrainians could compete against Russian and Belarusian athletes. But a blanket discrimination does not pass the proportionality test. Many athletes around the world come from conflict areas and may encounter each other during sports competitions. International sports federations are used to adopting protective and mitigating measures in such circumstances. There are already many experiences of tensions, conflicts, and national disasters that the world of sports has faced already, from which measures to address the current situation could be taken and adapted. Finally, in my discussions with the International Olympic Committee, I proposed that if all mitigating measures fail and decision is taken to ban individual athletes, the following criteria should apply. The ban should apply to all athletes, regardless of nationality or national origin, as well as on any other prohibited grounds under international law. No restriction should be applied to any athlete that is not applied to all. Also, any restriction must be based on an assessment that is transparent, fair, and non-discriminatory, with each case assessed on its own merit, including clear provisions for a fair and independent appeal process. Each situation and each case must be considered at an ad hoc basis, therefore preventing collective punishment. And we should rely on standards regarding possible limitations to human rights under international law that we already have, that international law already provides us with. So this includes, as I mentioned, exclusion based on Article 20 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, exclusion based on Article 4 of the International Convention on the Elimination of all forms of racial discrimination, exclusion in situations where there are serious and credible allegations of crimes under international law, in particular war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, aggression, torture, racial discrimination, and exclusion in case of open support to these crimes or wars in a manner that enables qualification under the above. Finally, I want to say something about the exclusion of all military. In its recommendation of 28th of March 2023, the International Olympic Committee recommended that athletes who actively support the war cannot compete. Athletes who are contracted to the Russian or Belarusian military or national security agencies are considered to support the war and therefore cannot compete. I agree with this. This is a step in a good direction. It also corresponds to my view that forced conscription alone, for example, would not be sufficient to deprive an athlete to compete. I also stress that as the situation unfolds and Russian and Belarusian athletes are reintegrated in sports competitions as neutral athletes, the International Olympic Committee may adopt a series of escalating measures in case this is necessary. Finally, I would like to urge all states in Council of Europe to reflect of their own responsibilities, their own obligations that they have undertaken under current international human rights law, and reflect on how they would justify the restricting measures for the inclusion of Russian and Belarusian athletes in sports events, and whether such exclusion would go against or would limit unnecessarily the obligations they have undertaken to respect cultural rights. I am really looking forward to learning more about the discussion, and I am here for further discussions and further events. Thank you.